Lagos smelled like rain and diesel the morning Obiageli Okonkwo first saw Hyansu Park standing outside her late father's textile shop, holding a photograph that should not have existed. She would replay that morning 1,000 times in the months to come, trying to find the exact second where her life split into a before and an after. But on that Tuesday, all she knew was that a tall Korean man in a gray coat was standing in 90% humidity, sweating through his collar, staring at a black and white photograph as if it had spoken to him. "Can I help you?" Obiageli asked, wiping her hands on her apron. She managed her father's shop now, 3 years after his death, surrounded by bolts of Ankara and lace that nobody in the family had the heart to sell off cheap. The man looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed, like he hadn't slept in days. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his English careful and accented. "A woman. She would be very old now if she is alive." He turned the photograph toward her. Obiageli's stomach dropped. The woman in the photograph was her grandmother, Isioma, 30 years old in the image, laughing at something outside the camera's frame, wearing a wrapper Obiageli recognized from a portrait that hung in her mother's parlor. But it was not her grandmother who made Obiageli's hands tremble. It was the man standing beside her in the photo. A young Korean man in a soldier's uniform, his arm around her grandmother's waist like he belonged there. Like the photograph was not an artifact of some forgotten history, but a love letter frozen in chemical paper. "Where did you get this?" Obiageli whispered. "My grandfather," Hyansu said. "He kept it in a locked drawer for 60 years. He died 3 weeks ago. This was the only thing he asked me to find before he went." The woman in this photograph. Isioma. He said her name like a prayer until his last breath. Obiageli did not know it yet, but she was standing at the beginning of something that would unravel 2 families across 2 continents, expose a 60-year-old secret buried in a war nobody talked about anymore, and bind her to a man whose presence in her life was either the most beautiful coincidence in the world, or something far more deliberate, far more dangerous, and far older than either of them. She invited him inside the shop, more out of shock than hospitality, and poured him a glass of zobo he didn't ask for and barely touched. He told her his grandfather's name was Kim Ji-ae, a man who had served as a UN peacekeeping engineer attached to a unit station near Enugu in the late 1960s, during the Nigerian Civil War, the Biafran War, as it was known to those who survived it. Ji-ae had spoken almost nothing of his time in Africa his entire life, except in the final feverish weeks of his illness, when the dying often say the things the living spend a lifetime swallowing. That he had spoken of a woman who saved his life. A nurse. Isioma. He had spoken of a child. Obiageli felt the floor tilt beneath her. Her grandmother had died when Obiageli was 11. A quiet, devout woman who went to mass every morning and never once, in Obiageli's memory, mentioned a Korean soldier or a war child or any secret that could explain the strange formality with which her own mother, Adana, spoke about her grandmother's early life. Adana had always changed the subject when asked about her father, the man whose name was conspicuously, permanently absent from every family document Obiageli had ever seen. "My mother," Obiageli said slowly, "has never known who her father was." Hyansu set down his glass. "Then maybe," he said, "we both came here looking for the same ghost." What began as an investigation became, over the following weeks, something neither of them had bargained for. Hyansu extended his stay in Lagos far beyond the 4 days he'd originally planned. He told his company, a Seoul-based architecture firm, that he needed 2 more weeks for family matters. A lie that felt smaller each day he spent in Obiageli's company. They visited the Catholic Mission Records office in Enugu, where a stooped archivist named Father Augustine, who had inherited the position from a priest who had inherited it from a priest before him, dug through water-damaged ledgers until he found a baptismal record from 1968. A child named Adana Park Okonkwo, mother Isioma Okonkwo, father listed only as KTS, Foreign National UNCRC. Obiageli's mother's name had been Park Okonkwo, a hyphen erased somewhere between 1968 and the woman Obiageli had grown up calling Mama, a woman who had quietly, deliberately scrubbed her own origin story so thoroughly that even her daughter never thought to question it. When they brought the record to Adana, she sat very still at her kitchen table for a long time before she finally spoke. She told them what her own mother, Isioma, had only confessed to her on her own deathbed. That during the war, Isioma had nursed a wounded Korean engineer back to health in a mission hospital outside Enugu, that they had fallen in love amid the chaos of starvation and shelling, and that when his unit was abruptly withdrawn in 1968, Extracted overnight under classified orders, no warning, no goodbye. Isioma never heard from him again. She'd assumed he was dead. She raised their daughter alone, dropped his initials from the family name to protect the child from a society that had no kindness for war children of foreign soldiers, and never spoke of him again except once, in her final hours, when she asked God's forgiveness for loving a man whose own country had apparently forgotten she existed. But Hyensu's grandfather had not forgotten. He had been recalled against his will, his letters to Isioma intercepted and destroyed by a commanding officer who considered the relationship a liability during a politically sensitive deployment. Giaite spent decades trying to get back to Nigeria, blocked by visa restrictions, war, poverty, the slow grinding indifference of bureaucracy, and finally by his own failing body. He married, much later, a Korean woman he never loved the way he loved Isioma, fathered Hyensu's mother out of obligation and loneliness, and carried his unfinished story like a stone in his chest for the rest of his life. Obiageli and Hyensu were, against every reasonable expectation, family. Cousins removed by half a world. The discovery reframed everything that had grown between them in those weeks of searching. Not a romance, they both understood almost instantly, but something rarer and in its own way just as disorienting. The sudden, vertiginous experience of gaining a close relative in adulthood, a person who shared her blood and his history and neither of them had known to look for. What replaced the earlier uncertainty was a fierce, protective loyalty. The sense of two broken family trees finally finding the missing branch that explained why both had always felt slightly incomplete that it would have been, on its own, a remarkable enough story. A 60-year-old wartime romance resurrected by its grandchildren, two continents stitched back together by photograph and bloodline. A film, even, that critics might call a tender meditation on memory, colonialism's quiet erasures, and the long shadow of war. But this is not where the story ends. It is barely where it begins. Because 3 weeks after the baptismal record surfaced, a second man arrived in Lagos. His name was Jae-won Cho, and he claimed to be a lawyer representing the estate of Kim Giaite. He was not the gentle, grief-stricken figure Hyensu had been. He was sharp-suited, cold-eyed, and he came with documents Hyensu had never seen. Documents suggesting that Kim Giaite had died an extraordinarily wealthy man, far wealthier than his modest life in Seoul had ever suggested, and that a clause in his will left the majority of a fortune, quietly accumulated through decades of patents Giaite held in marine engineering technology, not to his Korean children and grandchildren, but to any surviving Nigerian descendants of Isioma Okonkwo. Hyensu had not known about the will's contents. He had not known about the fortune. And the moment Jae-won Cho produced the documents, Obiageli watched something shift in Hyensu's eyes. Not greed, she would later swear, but a terrible, dawning suspicion that the entire trip, the photograph, perhaps even his own grandfather's dying confession, had been engineered, and that he had been a pawn in something far colder than a love story, Jae-won explained, with the practiced patience of a man delivering bad news for a living, that Giaite's Korean family, his daughter, his other grandchildren, a sprawling and embittered clan that had spent decades resenting the old man's emotional distance, his decades of staring out windows toward a continent none of them had ever visited, had contested the will the moment it was read. They had spent 3 years and considerable money trying to prove that no Nigerian descendants existed, that the entire story of a wartime lover was a fiction Giaite had constructed in his dementia-addled final years. Hyensu's trip to Lagos, ostensibly his own idea, born of grief and a grandson's love, had in fact been quietly underwritten by Jae-won's law firm, a fact Hyensu was only now learning in real time, in front of Obiageli, his face draining of color. "They sent you to find the family?" Obiageli said slowly. "So they could prove they don't deserve anything." "No," Hyensu said, but his voice cracked on the word. "I came because I wanted to know him. I wanted... Did they pay for your flight?" Hyensu. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The days that followed were the darkest of the entire affair. Not because of any single dramatic event, but because of the slow, corrosive erosion of trust between two people who had, despite everything, come to depend on each other in the space of a few short weeks. Obiageli withdrew. She stopped answering his calls. Her mother, newly raw from learning her own father's name for the first time at 55 years old, grew suspicious and afraid, certain now that the entire reunion had been a Trojan horse designed to extract a renunciation of inheritance from a family too unsophisticated in international law to know better. Hyensu, for his part, did something that would later be remembered. by Obiageli, by his own family, by anyone who eventually heard the full story, as either reckless or genuinely heroic, depending on who was telling it. He confronted Jae-won Cho directly, recorded the conversation on his phone, and extracted an admission that the law firm had been instructed by Jae-tae's eldest daughter, Hyun-soo's own aunt, to find the Nigerian family, document that they were, in the firm's words, unsophisticated and unlikely to retain counsel, and pressure them into signing a settlement for a token sum, far below the true value of the estate, before they understood what they were entitled to. It was, in other words, never about love at all from his family's side. It was about making the inconvenient truth of Kim Jae-tae's heart disappear quietly, the same way the Korean army had once made him disappear from Enugu without so much as a letter of explanation. Hyun-soo flew back to Seoul without telling Obiageli, and for 9 days she heard nothing. She assumed, in the bitter logic of heartbreak, that he had gone home to collect whatever scraps of the inheritance his family would allow him in exchange for his cooperation, that the boy with the kind, sleepless eyes who had cried reading his grandfather's letters in her father's old shop had been, after all, exactly as transactional as everyone else who had ever shown up in her life with promises she was wrong, and the manner in which she learned she was wrong became the turning point of the entire story. On the 10th day, a courier arrived at the shop. Not Hyun-soo himself, but a courier, carrying a thick envelope and a small black drive. Inside the envelope was a notarized, fully executed legal document. Hyun-soo had renounced his own claim to his grandfather's estate entirely, voluntarily, irrevocably, in favor of Adana Okonkwo and her descendants. He had hired his own lawyer, independent of his family's firm, using savings from his architecture practice, specifically to ensure the renunciation could not be contested or reversed. Attached to the document was a letter, handwritten, the ink occasionally smudged in a way that suggested it had been written and rewritten several times. In it, Hyun-soo explained that he had spent the 9 days of silence not negotiating with his family, but fighting them, sitting through 2 shareholder-style family council meetings where his aunt argued that paying off the Nigerians was the cheapest, fastest way to make the embarrassment disappear, and where Hyun-soo, for the first time in his quiet, conflict-averse life, had stood up in front of relatives who controlled his career prospects and his mother's approval, and told them that his grandfather had loved a woman for 60 years in silence because his own country had decided her existence was inconvenient, and that he refused to be the second generation of his family to do the same thing to her granddaughter. He wrote that he didn't care about the money. He wrote that finding Obiageli had nothing to do with what he'd been sent to find, and everything to do with what he hadn't known he was looking for. He wrote, in halting, imperfect English that Obiageli would later say moved her more than any fluent declaration could have, that his grandfather had died still loving a photograph, and that Hyun-soo refused to spend 60 years doing the same thing. The black drive, it turned out, contained something else entirely. Something that took the story from a tale of inheritance and unrequited wartime love into genuinely suspenseful territory. The kind that would keep an audience holding its breath through the final act. It contained scanned military correspondence Hyun-soo had found locked in his grandfather's old engineering case. Records Jae-tae had apparently kept hidden for decades. Proof that the 1968 withdrawal of his unit from Enugu had not been a routine rotation at all, but an emergency evacuation following the unit's discovery of unauthorized arms shipments being funneled through the UN peacekeeping channel by a senior Korean officer. A black market operation profiting off a famine-stricken war zone. Jae-tae had reported it. The officer responsible had been Jae-won Cho's own grandfather, a man who had spent the subsequent decades building the very law firm now representing Jae-tae's estate, a firm built, in no small part, on a fortune that traced back to that same arms trafficking operation. The inheritance dispute was never really about an old man's romantic guilt money at all. It was about silencing, a second time, the only surviving witness whose family could connect a war crime to a name that still mattered in Seoul's legal establishment. Jae-won Cho hadn't been protecting his client's interests. He'd been protecting his own grandfather's legacy, using Jae-tae's dying wish as cover to track down and quietly neutralize the very people who might, one day, ask uncomfortable questions about where the family fortune had truly come from. When Obiageli understood the full shape of it, the photograph, the love story, the inheritance, the cover-up reaching back across 60 years and 2 continents, she did not feel triumphant. She felt the cold, specific dread of someone who realizes she has become inconvenient to people with considerable resources and considerably fewer scruples. That dread proved justified within the week. Someone broke into her father's shop in the dead of night, ransacking the back office where she kept her grandmother's old letters and the baptismal record, though nothing of obvious monetary value was taken. The local police, unmoved by a robbery, in which nothing was stolen, filed a cursory report and moved on. But Obiageli knew, with the certainty of someone who has just learned how far a powerful family will go to protect a secret, that the break-in was a message, not a coincidence. She called Hyen-soo. For the first time since the courier's envelope, she heard real fear in his voice too. Jae-won-cho had stopped returning his calls, and a colleague at his architecture firm in Seoul had mentioned, almost in passing, that some lawyer had been asking unusual questions about Hyen-soo's recent travel and finances. The walls, on both continents, were closing in at 2 nights later. The pressure escalated in a way that turned the story from a quiet family mystery into something with real teeth. Adana received a phone call from a Lagos number she didn't recognize. A calm, unhurried male voice, speaking flawless English with the faintest trace of an accent she couldn't place, informing her that, for everyone's safety and peace of mind, it would be wise for the family to sign the settlement documents Jae-won-cho's firm had originally offered, and to do so quietly, without involving journalists or foreign lawyers. The man did not threaten her outright. He didn't need to. He simply mentioned, in passing, the names of Obiageli's 2 younger siblings, their university, the route Obiageli walked each morning from her flat to the shop. Details that should have meant nothing to a stranger making a routine legal inquiry. Adana, who had buried a husband and absorbed 60 years of her own mother's silence without ever once raising her voice in anger, sat her daughter down that night and told her, plainly, that she was afraid, not of losing the inheritance. She had lived without it her whole life and could live without it still, but of what people capable of arranging a break-in and a veiled threat against her grandchildren might do next if cornered. For the first time since the photograph appeared in her shop, Obiageli considered walking away from the entire affair. Returning the courier's documents unsigned, deleting Emika's draft, letting Jae-won-cho's firm keep its money and its secrets, and simply disappearing back into the ordinary rhythm of a life spent selling Ankara and lace that it was Emika, of all people, who talked her out of retreat. Not with bravado, but with the quiet stubbornness of a journalist who had spent 2 years watching. Bigger stories get killed by exactly this kind of fear. He reminded her that her great-grandmother's diary, her grandmother's stolen decades, her own mother's erased surname, were not abstractions to be traded away for safety. They were a record of exactly the kind of quiet, unaccountable power that depended on families like hers staying frightened and silent. If she folded now, the same thing would simply happen to the next inconvenient family the Cho fortune encountered, and the one after that, stretching forward exactly as it had stretched backward, generation after generation of people deciding it was safer not to ask questions. So instead of retreating, they got methodical. Hyen-soo, drawing on architecture firm contacts who did business across Seoul's legal and corporate circles, quietly verified that the threatening call had originated from a number registered to a private security contractor previously retained by Cho family interests. Proof, finally, that the intimidation could be traced back to the very people claiming to represent Jae-tae's estate in good faith. Emika, working with a Seoul-based correspondent he'd cultivated a relationship with during an earlier story, obtained shipping manifests from a maritime archive that corroborated the arms trafficking allegations independently of Jae-tae's own correspondence, meaning the story no longer rested on the word of one dead soldier's hidden letters, but on 2 separate, unconnected paper trails that told the same damning history. Obiageli, meanwhile, did something neither Hyen-soo nor Emika had anticipated. She went to the Catholic Mission Archive in Enugu a second time, alone, and asked Father Augustine whether any other mission records from that period had survived. Tucked in a box no one had opened in decades, she found something that turned the entire investigation from a private family matter into a story with implications neither family could have imagined. A second baptismal record, dated 4 months after her mother's, for a child born to a different young woman from the same village, father listed with the same initials, KTS, Foreign National, UNCRC. For one terrible, disorienting afternoon, Obiageli believed she had discovered evidence that Jae-tae had been unfaithful, that her grandmother's 60 years of devotion had been given to a man who did not deserve it. But a conversation with the elderly mission archivist and later, a final cross-reference against the military correspondence on Hyen-soo's drive, revealed the truth. The second child had not been fathered by Jae-tae at all, but by the very officer who had orchestrated the arms trafficking scheme, Jae-won-cho's grandfather, a man who had used his position and the chaos of the war to take advantage of a vulnerable young woman in the same village where Jae-tae and Isioma had fallen in love, and who had then ensured, through the same withdrawal order that severed Jae-tae from Isioma, That both inconvenient children would vanish from the official record along with his own crimes. It was a discovery that recast the entire conflict in sharper, more painful terms. Jae-won Cho was not merely protecting an old family fortune built on smuggled weapons. He was protecting the truth about a grandfather who had committed a far more personal violation, one with its own living, unacknowledged descendant somewhere in Enugu or beyond. A second cousin neither Obiageli nor Hyun-soo had ever known existed. The revelation gave Emika's eventual article its final, devastating dimension. This was never only a story about a stolen love and a contested will. It was about two different women in the same village, two different children erased from two different futures by the same withdrawal order, and one family's 6-decade campaign to make sure neither truth ever surfaced. With the maritime manifests, the military correspondence, and now the second baptismal record assembled into an account no lawyer could credibly dismiss as fabrication, Hyun-soo and Obiageli stopped playing defense. They reached out, carefully and through Emika's professional contacts, to journalists and human rights researchers in Seoul who had long been investigating the broader pattern of UN peacekeeping misconduct in 1960s conflict zones, ensuring that even if something happened to silence the family directly, the story itself could no longer be killed by a single intimidating phone call or a ransacked office. They built, in effect, a second copy of the truth and placed it somewhere beyond Jae-won Cho's reach, the same way intelligence operatives in old films protected themselves with insurance files. Except this insurance file was simply the truth, finally too well documented and too widely shared to disappear back into the silence it had survived inside for 60 years. What followed was the suspense-laden heart of the story, the section built for an audience leaning forward in their seats. Hyun-soo flew back to Lagos within 48 hours, this time not chasing a photograph but racing a threat. Together, he and Obiageli made the decision that would define the rest of the narrative. Rather than hide the evidence on the drive, they would make it impossible to bury by making it public and protected at the same time. Obiageli's cousin, a young investigative journalist named Emika who had spent 2 frustrating years chasing stories that never made it past skeptical editors, finally had the story of his career land in his lap. Working through 3 sleepless nights, cross-referencing Jae-tae's military correspondence with archived UN peacekeeping records and Korean corporate filings that traced Jae-won Cho's family wealth back to suspiciously timed asset acquisitions in the early 1970s, Emika built a documented, sourced, unimpeachable account of the arms trafficking operation and the cover-up that had followed it for over half a century. They did not publish immediately. Instead, in a move equal parts strategic and emotionally satisfying, Hyun-soo arranged a final meeting with his own family, the aunt who had orchestrated the original settlement scheme, and by extension, the law firm now apparently willing to intimidate a Nigerian family into silence to protect a 60-year-old crime. He did not threaten them directly. He simply placed copies of Emika's nearly finished exposé on the table, alongside the original correspondence, and explained, calmly, that the story would run in 5 days unless the family did 3 things. Publicly and formally acknowledge Adana Okonkwo as Jae-tae's rightful daughter, honor the original will's distribution of the estate without further legal contest, and sever all business and personal ties with the Cho family's law firm. His aunt, faced with the choice between a quiet, survivable family scandal and a public reckoning that would implicate the firm in decades-old war profiteering, capitulated within 2 days. Jae-won Cho, when confronted directly by his own firm's senior partners, who had no appetite for being publicly associated with a war crime regardless of how distant the perpetrator, resigned within the week, his attempts to intimidate the Okonkwo family having spectacularly backfired into the very exposure he'd been trying to prevent. The story could have ended there, with legal documents and quiet settlements, and for many viewers that might have been resolution enough. But the version of the story worth telling on screen does not end in a boardroom. It ends in Enugu, at the site of the long-since demolished mission hospital where Isioma once nursed a dying foreign soldier back to health amid the wreckage of a war that swallowed millions of lives and erased countless quieter stories like theirs. Only a single wall of the old hospital still stood, swallowed now by bush and creeping vine, marked by a small plaque the Catholic mission had placed decades ago, commemorating the medical staff who had served there. It was there that Hyun-soo, 6 months after first walking into Obiageli's father's shop with a photograph in his trembling hands, gathered both families together and read aloud, in halting Korean and then in English, the last letter his grandfather had written to Isioma and never been allowed to send, recovered finally from the same locked case that had held the evidence of a war crime. In it, 60 years late, Jae-tae told Isioma everything he had never been permitted to say, that he loved her, that he would come back for her no matter how long it took, that no ocean or army or border could be wider than what he felt watching her work through the night to save strangers' lives in a hospital with no real medicine and barely any light. The letter was not addressed to Hyeon-soo or Obiageli. It belonged to Adana, and it was to her that Hyeon-soo handed it when he finished reading, watching a 55-year-old woman receive, at last, the words her mother had died without ever hearing. Obiageli stood beside her mother in the ruins of the place where her grandparents' love story had been born and brutally interrupted. Her hand steady on Adana's shoulder, both of them finishing, finally, what two governments and one greedy, frightened family had spent 60 years trying to prevent. The reunion ceremony, held 8 months later in Lagos, blended both worlds in a way that felt less like compromise and more like restoration. A Korean tea ceremony performed beside an Igbo, traditional wine-carrying ceremony, not to unite a bride and groom but to formally welcome two branches of Giaite's descendants into a single family. Obiageli's mother, Adana, wore her own mother's old wrapper alongside a hanbok gifted by Hyeon-soo's mother, who had flown in despite her sister's continued bitterness, determined not to lose the only living connection to the father she'd never properly known. Emika's article ran 2 weeks before the ceremony, not as a scandal piece but as a sweeping, deeply reported feature on a forgotten wartime love story and the cover-up that had nearly buried it twice, first by an army, and almost a second time by a family's greed. It went viral across both Nigerian and Korean media, prompting an unexpected wave of letters from other families on both continents who had their own buried stories of wartime relationships, severed by politics, racism, and bureaucratic cruelty. Months after the ceremony, Obiageli and Hyeon-soo stand together in the same textile shop where it all began, now expanded with funds from the rightfully restored inheritance into a small foundation the two cousins run together, dedicated to reconnecting families separated by Cold War-era military deployments across Africa and Asia. A foundation named, simply, Isioma and Giaite's house. On the wall behind the front counter hangs the original photograph, the one that started everything, newly framed. No longer a fragile secret hidden in a dying man's drawer but a testament displayed proudly for every visitor to see. Two young people from opposite sides of the world, caught in a single unguarded moment of love. Finally, 60 years later, given the ending they were always owed. The story closes not with a courtroom victory, but with something quieter and more devastating in its tenderness. Obiageli, alone in the shop at closing time, finds a small leather diary tucked into a box of her grandmother's old effects that had never been fully sorted. It is Isioma's diary from 1968, water-stained and fragile, and on its final page, dated the week after Giaite's unit vanished overnight, Isioma had written a single line that Obiageli calls Hyeon-soo to read aloud, her voice breaking on every word. "I do not know if he is alive or dead, only that some loves do not end when the people are separated. They simply wait, patient as scar tissue, for the day someone finally comes looking." The screen fades to black on Obiageli closing the diary in the quiet shop, the phone still warm in her hand, two grandchildren finally closing a wound that had outlived the war that caused it, the war that everyone else had long since agreed to forget.